Okay, today we are going to resume reading through the history books of the Bible. We read through the time of Solomon down to the death of Solomon. Then we stopped for a while to read the books attributed to Solomon, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. And now we are going to continue on as we finish that. So now we're going to continue on with reading through the history and King as recorded in Kings and Chronicles. We'll be going back and forth between Kings and Chronicles frequently as we do this. Remember, Kings was written first. Chronicles was written later. Kings was compiled by scribes at some point after the events in question happened. There was some sort of contemporary record keeping going on during the days of the Kings. As we'll read about when we read through these books, we're going to read at the end of each account of the Kings, the author is going to mention that their extra material about these kings is recorded in other books, which of course are long since lost to us today. Unfortunately, it'd be nice to have those books. We don't. They still existed in the days of the author, whenever that may have been, but we don't have them today. So the books of Kings are drawing from other sources that were written down at the time these events happened. And this document that we have now is compiled from that. And Chronicles was written a couple of centuries later, after the return from exile, by probably a single person who took everything that he had available to him and wrote the Chronicles. They cover the same time period, but they cover from different perspectives. Kings is going to focus, now we're going to get right here in the very next chapter we read, 1 Kings 12. The kingdom is going to split into two. Israel is going to go from being one united nation under a single king to two split nations under two different kings with two different capitals. And it's going to stay that way. So they're going to be divided in the north and the south, and they're going to stay that way. And both kingdoms are eventually going to be conquered and taken into captivity by other neighboring kingdoms. Well, not really neighboring, but other kingdoms. The northern kingdom will go first, and then about a century plus later, the southern kingdom will go. Eventually, the southern kingdom will come back, and that's going to be the story of the rest of the Old Testament. So they're never going to be united again, at least not under one kingdom, not one physical kingdom. They will be reunited again in the kingdom of the Messiah. That's the days to come, but they're never going to be a physical united kingdom again. So we're going to be going back now. Kings, the book of 1st and 2nd Kings, will be going back and forth between the southern and northern kingdom as it goes through its history. It is not going to ignore the northern kingdom, even though the northern kingdom is going to basically ignore God and will fall away faster and will go off into captivity and will never come back, essentially. This is the book of Kings, and we'll record that and show us the progression as the northern kingdom falls away and breaks away and falls away. Chronicles is not even going to bother with the northern kingdom. When we get down to Chronicles, there will be a few mentions of the northern kings when they become important to the chronicler's narrative of the southern kingdom. But the chronicler is not going to spend time talking about the northern kingdom for the most part. The books of Kings will. We will read a lot about the northern kingdom in the books of Kings. So these accounts are about the same time period, about largely the same events, but they're written from different perspectives and have slightly different information, which is why we're going to go back and forth between the two. We will eventually, as we go through this, we will eventually get down to the days of the prophets. And so just like when we got through the days of Solomon, after I finished the days of Solomon, I stopped and then I read through the books of Solomon. And eventually when we get to the prophets, we're going to stop and read through the individual books of the prophets. We're still not there yet. That's still about a century away from where we are right now. But the prophets, at least the ones the ones that we think about when we think of prophets, the writing prophets, the ones who came and said, "Thus saith the Lord," and wrote all these books in the second half of our Old Testaments. They came along in the days of the kingdom, the split kingdom, when both kingdoms were having trouble following God, and they spoke mainly to the kings The prophet, the office of the prophet at this point kind of transitions to being mainly a guy who speaks to the king. Not always. There are going to be some prophets who take their message to the people. Some of them are going to take their message to foreign kings, like Jonah and Obadiah or Nahum, but they're basically going to be speaking to the kings. Now, there's always been spokesmen for God all throughout the Bible, from the beginning until now. But now, in this era, the prophets are going to be primarily God's spokesmen to the kings. But we're a little ways away from that. We're not quite there yet. We got to go through another several chapters of history, of pure history at this point. Now we're getting into the era, by the way, as we get into the divided monarchy. We're getting into the era where there's not really a lot of dispute over this history. Okay, before this, you've got the smart people who want to say none of it happened. Nowadays, from this point onward, we're getting into pretty solid history that no one really disputes. There's still going to be some problems of dating. I mean, we're still in the 900s BC, which is a pretty long time ago. There's still going to be problems of dating. There are still going to be problems of misidentifying pharaohs. We're going to be having an issue with that right here. We deal with the pharaoh in this section, a guy named Shishak, who's been misidentified as somebody else. So we still have that, but for the most part, there's not a lot of dispute about whether or not these events happened. You're not going to read a lot of people who will say that this part of the Bible's history is all made up. They will say that about the previous sections. They don't really say this about this section. One thing that I don't know if I mentioned it before. I should have. I meant to. I'm not sure if I did. I can't remember if I did. When I was reading through the lifetime of David, because David is one of those guys that the smart people have a problem with. They don't like to acknowledge the existence of David. And there are reasons for this. I mean, David was, and Solomon too, for that matter. He was about 1000 BC. And he was just a little bit too far back in the curtain, behind the curtain of history. Once you get about a century beyond David, about to the time where we are now, actually, around 900 BC, things start becoming a little bit clearer, and they get clearer and clearer as you go forward in time. You go as far back as David, and it's just a little foggy. You go any farther back than David, and it starts getting really foggy. So David is still just a little bit too far back in the midst of time to really make out clearly. So you have that issue. You also have the problem, you also have the problem where people just frankly don't want to admit David exists because Jesus Christ is the son of David. So one way to deny the authority of Jesus Christ is to say, well, there is no David. A lot of it really does come down to that. If Jesus Christ is who he says he is, and he is Lord of the world today, even now, and we're all going to have to give an account to him someday at the end of our days. If that is true, if everything he says about himself is true, then part of what he says about himself is that he is the son of David. So if we don't want to believe that, if we don't want to have to face that, one way that we can try to deny that is by saying, well, there is no such thing as David. David is a myth, he's a legend, so therefore Jesus Christ claiming to be the son of David is nonsensical. It doesn't matter. And therefore we can weaken the credibility of Christ and his other claims too. So that's ultimately really the motivation behind it, whether or not it's expressed, articulated, or even acknowledged, or even really we're aware of it, honestly. That really is the motivation behind it. But there is also just a simple fact of, like I said, David is a little bit too far back in history. And our perception of things, recency bias is a very real thing. And our perception of things can just be a little bit fuzzy when it comes to things like this. We can kind of we can get to a point where we think to ourselves where something that did happen didn't really happen because it just seems like it couldn't. A great example of this that happened just in recent days, right here in our own day and time. A couple of years ago, in the early days of the pandemic, May of 2020, there was this documentary that was produced about Michael Jordan of the Chicago Bulls. During the big, Bulls era of the 90s, Michael Jordan, the Chicago Bulls, won 6 NBA titles, 2 three-peats. And it was, I lived through it. I was young when it started, but I lived through it, and I remember most of it. I watched the documentary, I remember most of it from this, I certainly remember everything about the second three-peat. I remember most of the stuff about the first three-peat, too. His early days in the 80s were fuzzy to me because I was a child back then. Now, he was in Chicago, and we don't have an NBA team here in the St. Louis area. So my brother, my older brother, who is 5 years older than me, was a Chicago Bulls fan because they were the closest NBA team, or at least they're in our state. I live in Illinois. I'm in the southern Illinois area across the river from St. Louis. If St. Louis had an NBA team, we would have been, St. Louis NBA team fans, but it doesn't. It hasn't since I've been alive. So since Chicago was in our state, we were Chicago Bulls fans. We got the Chicago paper. We watched the Chicago station, WGN. We got the Chicago Tribune. So we were Bulls fans. And so, my older brother is 5 years older than me, so he remembered Michael Jordan from before I did in the 80s. And so I was aware of Michael Jordan from the beginning. As a kid, I was a little bit, his early days are fuzzy to me because I was a kid then, but I remember the 90s very well. I remember the second three-peat particularly well. I was a teenager then. But what's interesting is that in the years since then, after the Bulls ended, he actually played for the Washington Wizards for a couple of years in the early 2000s, and then finally retired for good. Then he went to the Hall of Fame in 2008. Then LeBron James came along, and Kobe Bryant was actually kind of the guy who was supposed to be the successor to Michael Jordan, and LeBron James after him. And neither of those guys was as good or as dominant. Neither of those guys could do what Michael Jordan did. And over the course of time, from 2000 basically, the Bulls won their last title in '98. Jordan played his last NBA game in 2003. From 2000 onward to 2020, when this documentary aired, 20 years between, people's memories got fuzzy. Their perception of that time period, the 80s and 90s of the NBA, got skewed. It seemed like it couldn't have happened. It was just too good to be true. When we during those from 2000 to 2020, as those years went on, you started to see like this shift in the thinking. Oh, that didn't really happen. That couldn't have really happened. It couldn't have been as we remember it was. There had to be something going on. And then this documentary happens in 2020, and since it's COVID, this was before the George Floyd protests, which happened almost immediately after. This was in the middle of May 2020, during COVID and before George Floyd. And so nobody in the country had anything to do but sit at home and watch Michael Jordan's documentary. And so as we did this, we all just kind of suddenly remember, especially those of us in my age and older who actually experienced it in real time. We all just kind of suddenly remember, this really did happen. This isn't made up. This wasn't a figment of our imaginations. We weren't remembering this wrong. This really happened. It seems too good to be true. It couldn't happen today. It couldn't. Okay? The rise of the NBA and Michael Jordan, which went together in the 80s and 90s, like that couldn't happen today. The circumstances which allowed that to occur during that period of time don't exist today. So that can't happen today. It can't. No one's going to do that today. It's not possible. But it did exist. It did happen then. It was possible then. Someone did do it then, and we weren't misremembering it. We weren't remembering it wrong. Our perception had gotten skewed because we just had gotten to the point over the years in between where we just didn't think that could really happen. So there's an example in our own lives. And again, I'm 40 years old. Okay, I was a child in the 80s when Michael Jordan went through college and then into the NBA in the mid 80s. I was 10 years old when he won his first title, and I saw, throughout the 90s, I was growing up, and I remembered that. Of course, then you had the sports writers and the sportscasters who were already adults at the time, who were 15, 20 plus years older than me. And it's like they got surprised by it too. It's like they had forgotten what it was really like there, even though they were in there. They covered it. Some of them were even in Chicago. Remember, I read the Chicago paper. I watched the Chicago news stations, WGN. I saw these people. I read their articles as they were writing them, and then and their career now, they're 20 years older now. If they were 40 then, they're 60 now. They had forgotten what it was really like. So there's an example in our own lives, in our own time, of how something that like a mythic hero story can just get obscured in a way that it doesn't seem like it could have happened. And it did happen. And it happened in the 20th century. And it happened in an era of extensive video and photographic evidence, interviews. Okay, we have footage, we have the tapes. We can go back and watch this stuff whenever we want to and be reminded of, oh yeah, this actually happened. The men involved are still alive. Michael Jordan is, I don't even know if he's 60. Is he 60 yet? I mean, his teammates are still alive. I think one of the general manager is not any longer. It's like the people involved are still alive. Many of the sportscasters who covered it at the time are still alive, and still of them are still, many of them haven't even retired yet from their careers. The fans are still alive. Now, you do have this issue with the younger fans who weren't alive at the time. Okay? But those of us who are old enough, my age or older, who are old enough to remember at least part of it, if not all of it, it's like, well, it happened. Like, it did happen. We had kind of forgotten that. We had gotten to the point in the 20 years in between where we just assumed it couldn't have been that way, because it just doesn't seem like it could have been. So we can get to this point. We can look back at a story. David seems like a story. We read all about David and Samuel and in the beginning of Kings and First Chronicles. It seems like a story. It seems too good to be true. Okay, it seems like a myth. That doesn't necessarily mean that it is. Okay, there are times when these sorts of things happen. Oh, excuse me. So that is basically, and now it's not going to be too good to be true from now on. Israel's glory is past, and they've got pretty much nothing but trouble in the future. There's going to be a few periods of time here and there where things are going to be better than worse. But for the most part, here we are in 930 BC, for the most part, from here going forward, it's only going to get worse. It's not going to be like it was in the days of David and Solomon again. That era is past. And they're going to want that back. Okay, as we go forward, and things kind of just gradually get worse and worse and worse, with a few bumps here and there, but not too many, and even those kind of dwindle off as time goes on. They're going to keep looking back to that time that they heard about. That probably seems too good to be true even to them at the time, about when they were the big dogs, when they were the major power, when they were at peace and security and living in that garden-like state of Eden, as close to it as possible at least. They're going to want that back. So that's going to be kind of the story going forward here. So we're going to pick that back up again here in 1 Kings 12.